The crack of bone against bone was a sharp, ugly sound that cut through the placid afternoon air. It was the sound of a world breaking. On the porch of a small, well-kept house, a boy stood over a girl. His name was Richie Sterling, and his face, usually a mask of smug entitlement, was twisted into a snarl of pure rage. The girl, Lily, was on her knees, one hand clutching a jaw that was already beginning to swell, tears streaming down her face. She was 15. He was 17. But in that moment, the difference was a lifetime of power against a lifetime of fear. A low growl rumbled from the doorway. Max, a German shepherd with fur the color of sable and eyes that held the wisdom of old battles, moved from the shadows of the house onto the porch. He did not bark. He did not snarl aggressively. He simply placed his body between Richie and Lily, a living shield of loyalty. His posture was a declaration. "You will not touch her again." Richie Sterling laughed, a cruel, sharp sound. "Get your stupid mutt out of my face, Lily." When Lily didn't respond, only sobbed quietly behind the dog, Richie's rage flared anew. He drew back his leg, his expensive leather shoe a dark blur, and kicked. He kicked with all the force his athletic frame could muster, aiming for the dog's ribs. The impact was a sickening thud, followed by a sharp yelp of pain from Max. The dog stumbled, his legs buckling, but he didn't fall. He shook his head, a whimper escaping his throat. Yet he held his ground. He was a veteran, a former military working dog who had seen worse than this spoiled child. But pain was still pain. The scene was frozen for a moment, the boy triumphant, the girl broken, the dog wounded but resolute. And across the street, neighbors peered through their blinds, their faces pale, their hands doing nothing. This is the moment evil believes it has won. But they were all wrong, because down the street, another veteran was coming home. John Kane turned the corner onto the quiet suburban lane. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of years of disciplined training. His shoulders were broad, his hands steady. He was a man built for carrying heavy things, and for years that had meant a rifle and the lives of his brothers. Now it was just groceries. He had promised Lily's father, his fallen brother in arms, that he would look after her. It was a promise etched into his soul. He saw the tableau on the porch from 100 yards away. He didn't run. He didn't shout. His walk simply became faster, more purposeful. The grocery bag in his hand was an afterthought. His focus narrowed until the only things in the world were the girl on the ground, the dog standing guard, and the boy raising his foot for a second kick. John was 50 yards away when Richie kicked again. This time Max collapsed, his breath knocked out of him in a pained gasp. Something inside John, a cold, dormant thing, awoke. He was there in an instant. He didn't seem to cross the remaining distance so much as he simply appeared. One moment he was on the sidewalk. The next his hand was clamped around Richie Sterling's wrist, stopping his arm mid-swing. John's grip was like iron, not crushing, not meant to break, just absolute, unmovable. "Let go," he said. His voice was quiet. It was lower than a whisper, yet it carried more weight than a scream. It was the voice of a man who had given commands in the dark, under fire, and had been obeyed without question. Richie Sterling, who had never been told no with any real consequence in his life, stared at the man's hand on his wrist, then up at the cold, blue eyes. For the first time, he felt a sliver of something unfamiliar. It was fear. "Who the hell are you?" Richie spat, trying to wrench his arm free. He couldn't. It was like trying to pull steel out of concrete. John didn't answer the question. He simply tightened his grip a fraction of an inch, his gaze flicking from the boy's face to Lily on the ground, to the whimpering dog. His eyes catalogued every detail. The bruise forming on Lily's cheek, the shallow, pained breaths of the dog, the arrogance in the boy's eyes warring with a dawning panic. "You need to leave," John said. It wasn't a suggestion. Richie, bolstered by a lifetime of his father's money and influence, found his voice again. "You don't know who I am. My father owns half this town. He'll have you arrested." John's expression didn't change. He applied a subtle pressure to a nerve cluster in Richie's wrist. The boy's hand went numb, his fingers tingling, his bravado evaporated. "I said, leave." John released him. Richie stumbled back, cradling his wrist, his face a mask of shock and fury. He glared at John, then at Lily, a final, venomous look. "This isn't over," he hissed, before turning and stalking away, pulling out his phone to make a call. John didn't watch him go. His attention was already elsewhere. He knelt beside Lily, his movements gentle, a stark contrast to the coiled steel he had just been. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. Lily couldn't speak. She just shook her head, tears flowing freely now, a mix of pain, fear, and a dawning, fragile relief. He then turned to Max, who was struggling to get to his feet. John ran a practiced hand over the dog's flank, feeling for broken bones. He found badly bruised ribs, but nothing seemed shattered. Max licked his hand, his tail giving a weak, tentative thump against the wooden porch. John looked at Lily, at the terror in her eyes. He saw the shadow of Richie Sterling, and behind him, the larger, more menacing shadow of his father. He knew this was not just a schoolyard fight. This was the beginning of something. He met her gaze, his own eyes holding a certainty that was as absolute as his grip had been. "This ends now," he said. "I promise you." It was a promise made in the quiet of a violated afternoon. It was a promise he intended to keep. Later that evening, the phone rang. John answered, already knowing who it would be. The voice on the other end was smooth, cultured, and coated in a thick layer of condescending authority. "Mr. Kane, this is Richard Sterling." John remained silent, listening. "I understand there was a misunderstanding today involving my son," Sterling continued. "Teenagers can be emotional. I trust it's all been settled." "Your son assaulted a minor and kicked her dog," John stated, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. There was a pause. Sterling's smooth tone became edged with ice. "My son is a good boy. He was provoked. Now I'm prepared to be generous. I can make a significant contribution to a charity of your choice. Perhaps a fund for, I do not know, wounded animals. We can all forget this unfortunate incident." John looked across the living room where Lily was asleep on the sofa, Max lying at her feet, his head on her lap. The dog would occasionally whimper in his sleep. "There is no price for what your son did," John said. Sterling's sigh was theatrical, impatient. "You have no idea what you are starting, Mr. Kane. You are a man of limited means. I am not. This town runs on my goodwill. The police, the school board, they are all my friends. Do you really want to make an enemy of me?" John thought of his own friends, men who had walked through fire with him, men who understood loyalty and sacrifice in a way Richard Sterling never could. "You're the one who doesn't understand," John said, his voice dropping even lower. "You think your money is a shield. It's not. It's a target. You and your son are going to answer for what you did. That is not a threat. It is a statement of fact." He hung up the phone. The war had begun. The first battle was lost before it even started. John took Lily to the police station the next morning. The officer at the desk, a man with a tired face and a burgeoning gut, listened to their story with a practiced air of disinterest. He took notes, his pen scratching slowly across the form. When John mentioned the name Richie Sterling, the officer's posture changed. He stopped writing. He looked up, his eyes suddenly wary. "Richard Sterling's boy?" he asked. "That's the one," John confirmed. The officer sighed and put his pen down. "Look, son, I am sure it was just a teenage squabble. Kids fight. And you put your hands on the boy. That's assault, you know." "I stopped him from hurting her further," John said, his voice dangerously calm. "He says you injured his wrist," the officer countered. "We have a report from his father. They're considering pressing charges against you." John stared at the man, seeing not a protector of the peace, but a gatekeeper for the powerful. He saw the tendrils of Richard Sterling's influence wrapped around the very institution that was supposed to provide justice. "Are you going to take our statement?" John asked. "I have," the officer said, gesturing to the half-filled form. "We'll look into it." They both knew he wouldn't. They left the station and went to the school principal. The result was the same. The principal, a woman who spoke in therapeutic platitudes, listened patiently. She expressed her deep concern. She also mentioned the new gymnasium, funded entirely by a generous donation from the Sterling family. "Perhaps Lily and Richie could enter mediation," she suggested brightly, "to talk through their feelings." John stood up. "Thank you for your time." Outside, Lily's shoulders slumped. "It's no use," she whispered. "They own everything." "They don't own us," John said, his jaw tight. "And they don't own the truth." The harassment started subtly. A post appeared on a local social media page. It was an anonymous account, claiming a disturbed veteran had attacked a local high school student. Comments flooded in, painting John as a violent, unstable man, a danger to the community. His military service was twisted from a badge of honor into a sign of mental instability. Then their tires were slashed, all four of them, in the middle of the night. No one saw anything. A rock came through the living room window a few nights later. Wrapped around it was a note. "Leave it alone." John swept up the glass, his movements precise and controlled. Inside, a cold rage was building. It was a familiar feeling, a controlled burn he had learned to manage in the furnace of combat. It was the rage that sharpened his senses, that made him think with crystalline clarity. He installed a security system, military-grade sensors on all windows and doors. He spent hours on the porch, watching, observing the patterns of the neighborhood. He was back in a war zone, only this time the enemy wore polo shirts and drove luxury cars. They tried to intimidate Lily at school. Whispers followed her down the hall. Richie's friends would bump into her, knocking books from her hands. They never left a mark, but the constant pressure was designed to wear her down, to make her feel isolated and afraid. John saw the fear in her eyes when she came home each day. But he also saw something else beginning to grow, a flicker of defiance. One evening, she was staring at a picture on the mantelpiece. It was her father, young and smiling in his dress uniform. "Dad wasn't afraid of anyone," she said quietly. "No, he wasn't," John agreed. "I don't want to be afraid either," she said, her voice gaining strength. John put a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to be. We do this together." He knew then that Richard Sterling had made a critical miscalculation. He thought he was fighting a lone, broken veteran and a scared little girl. He was wrong. He was fighting a legacy. John knew he couldn't fight this war alone, not against an enemy so deeply entrenched. The system was compromised, so he would have to build his own. He made his first call to a number he hadn't dialed in over a year. It was answered on the second ring. "Reaper," a gravelly voice said. "It's John." There was a pause, then a warmth entered the voice. "Johnny boy, good to hear your voice. Everything all right? I need a favor." "Name it." There was no hesitation, no questions about what or why. That was the code. John explained the situation, his words clipped and precise, a military briefing. He detailed Sterling's influence, the police inaction, the harassment. "So, the snake has his nest in the town hall," Reaper summarized. "Standard insurgency tactics required. Win hearts and minds, cut off the head." "Something like that," John said. "I need eyes, and I need technical support." "Consider it done," Reaper said. "Ghost is on his way to you. He'll bring a care package. I'll handle the digital side from here. Send me everything you have on Sterling. Financials, business partners, ex-wives. We'll find the cracks." Ghost arrived 2 days later. He was a wiry man with a quiet intensity and a gift for blending into the background. He moved like smoke. His care package contained encrypted laptops, listening devices, and high-resolution surveillance cameras that were nearly invisible to the naked eye. Together, they fortified the house. They swept for bugs and found 2 cheap ones, likely planted by a low-rent private investigator. They replaced them with their own devices. They set up cameras covering every approach to the property. "Now we watch," Ghost said, his eyes scanning a bank of monitors. "Let the enemy make his move." The next call John made was to a local number. Sarah Jenkins was an investigative reporter for the town's small, independent newspaper. He'd read her work. She had a reputation for being fearless, and for years, she had been trying to expose the rot at the heart of the town's elite. She'd written several articles hinting at Richard Sterling's corrupt land deals and political manipulations, but she'd never been able to make anything stick. They met in a quiet diner on the edge of town. John laid out the story, providing the police report number he knew had been buried. Sarah listened, her pen flying across her notepad. Her eyes, which had looked weary when he sat down, were now bright with a familiar, hungry fire. "I've been hearing whispers about Sterling for years," she said. "Stories of him silencing business partners, harassing people who wouldn't sell their land. But no one would ever go on the record. They were all too afraid." "They shouldn't be," John said. "John, give me something I can print, something I can verify," she said, leaning forward. "And I will burn his kingdom to the ground." "We're working on it," John told her. "For now, I need you to find other victims. People he's bullied. People he's paid off. Let them know they're not alone anymore." The final piece of the alliance was Marcus Thorne. He was a lawyer, but he was nothing like the polished corporate attorneys Sterling kept on retainer. Marcus was a former Marine JAG officer with a shaved head, a scarred knuckle, and a reputation as a pit bull in the courtroom. He worked pro bono for veterans and others the system had failed. John found him in a cramped office above a laundromat, the walls covered in military memorabilia and framed commendations. Marcus listened to the story without interruption, his steepled fingers resting on his chin. When John finished, he nodded slowly. "Sterling," he said, the name tasting like ash in his mouth. "I know him. I represented a family he tried to force out of their home to build one of his gaudy resorts. He buried them in legal fees until they had to declare bankruptcy." "We need to fight him," John said. "Fighting him in a courtroom he owns is a fool's errand," Marcus stated. We don't file a lawsuit. We build an ironclad criminal case. We don't aim for his wallet. We aim for a prison cell." He stood and extended a hand to John. "I'm in. No charge." The team was assembled. The warrior, the ghost, the voice, and the law. While Ghost and Reaper built a digital dossier on Sterling's empire, Sarah Jenkins started digging. She worked her sources, calling old contacts, chasing down rumors. She found them, one by one. A former contractor whose business was ruined when he refused to cut corners on a Sterling construction project. A young woman who had worked at his country club and had been fired after reporting Richie for harassment. A family who had been threatened into silence after their son was injured in a hit and run by a car matching Richie's. Each story was the same. An act of arrogance or cruelty, followed by threats, intimidation, and finally, a non-disclosure agreement with a paltry sum of money attached. Fear had kept them silent. Sarah and John visited them. At first, they were met with closed doors and hushed, fearful refusals. But John's quiet presence and Sarah's persistent, empathetic questioning began to wear them down. "He can't hurt all of us," Sarah would argue. "He only has power because you've given it to him," John would add, his voice a steady anchor. Slowly, tentatively, they began to talk. They shared their stories, their voices growing stronger with each telling. A small coalition of the silenced was being formed. They agreed to give sworn affidavits to Marcus, who began building a file that documented a pattern of racketeering, intimidation, and obstruction of justice. The enemy, however, was not idle. Richard Sterling felt the shift in the air. He felt the ground beneath his throne begin to tremble. His private investigators reported on John's meetings. His informants at the newspaper warned him about Sarah's questions. He decided it was time to escalate, to remind everyone who was in charge. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon. Lily was walking home from school. She had started taking a different route, one that was more public, but Richie and his friends were waiting for her. They cornered her in a narrow alleyway between the library and the post office, a place with no cameras. This time, there was no pretense of a schoolyard scuffle. This was pure, calculated brutality. Richie grabbed her, his face a mask of cold fury. "You and that freak you live with," he spat, his voice low and menacing. "You think you can win? My father owns you. He owns this whole pathetic town." He shoved her against the brick wall. The impact knocked the wind out of her. "Please stop," she begged, her voice a thin whisper. But then she remembered her father's picture. She remembered John's promise. A spark of defiance ignited in her chest. She looked him straight in the eye. "I am not scared of you anymore." Her courage enraged him. He hit her. His friends held her down while he kicked and punched her, his rage uncontrolled, his blows landing on her stomach, her back, her arms. She curled into a ball, trying to protect herself. But through the pain, a cold clarity seized her. She fought back. Not with strength she didn't have, but with purpose. She reached up and clawed at his face, her fingernails digging deep into his skin, drawing blood. He screamed and struck her one last time across the head. Her world went dark. John found her 20 minutes later. Someone had made an anonymous call to 911. The paramedics were already there when he arrived, his truck screeching to a halt. He saw her on the stretcher, her face bruised and swollen, a deep gash on her forehead. She was unconscious. Something inside him broke. The cold, controlled rage he had managed for so long shattered, and what was left was a silence more terrifying than any scream. He stood there, watching them load her into the ambulance, and in that moment, he made a decision. He rode with her to the hospital, his hand holding hers. his knuckles white. He sat in the waiting room while the doctors worked on her. Concussion, 3 broken ribs, severe bruising. She would live. But she was broken. When he was finally allowed to see her, she was sleeping, her breathing shallow. He looked at her battered face, and the last vestiges of his faith in the system turned to dust. The rules of engagement had changed. He walked out of the hospital room and made a call. "Reaper," he said, his voice a flat, dead thing. "It's done." "What's happened, John?" Reaper's voice was sharp with concern. "They put her in the hospital," John said. "The by-the-book approach is over. We're ending this. Tonight." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. Then, "What's the plan?" "The plan is we burn it all down." John's team moved with the speed and efficiency of a SEAL unit preparing for a mission. There was no more waiting, no more strategy, only execution. Reaper, from his remote location, focused his efforts. He had been slowly mapping the Sterling corporate network, but now he went on the offensive. He bypassed firewalls and security protocols with surgical precision. He wasn't looking for financial data anymore. He was looking for a ghost. Every modern business, especially one as corrupt as Sterling's, had a digital, dirty secret. Deleted emails, hidden server directories, and most importantly, security footage. Ghost had identified the location of the Sterling Enterprises main server farm weeks ago. It was housed in a nondescript building downtown, a digital fortress. But Reaper wasn't interested in a frontal assault. He was a whisper, not a battering ram. He found a back door, an overlooked maintenance port in the building's climate control system. He slipped inside the network. He found what he was looking for in a deep archive folder, mislabeled and triple encrypted. The security footage from the alleyway. It had been automatically uploaded from a private camera on a Sterling-owned building, then immediately deleted by Sterling's security chief. But deleted was a relative term. Reaper recovered the file. It was clean, high definition. It showed everything. The ambush, the beating. It even showed Richie Sterling looking directly at the camera with a smirk before he delivered the final, sickening blow. It was undeniable. He downloaded the file and sent a single encrypted message to John. "Got him." John received the message as he was meeting with Marcus and Sarah in the hospital cafeteria. He looked at them, his eyes like chips of ice. "We have it," he said. "The proof." Marcus nodded, his face grim. "Good, because I have something too." He slid a file across the table. It contained the sworn affidavits from the other victims. "And I just got off the phone with a contact in the DA's office. Not everyone there is on Sterling's payroll. There's one man, an old bulldog from the organized crime unit, who hates bullies like Sterling. He's willing to listen, but he needs something public, something that forces his hand and gives him political cover." Sarah looked up from her laptop. "There's a town council meeting tonight. It's a special session to approve the zoning for Sterling's new waterfront project. He'll be there himself, giving a speech. It's always televised on the local access channel." The pieces clicked into place. A public forum, an arrogant villain, confident in his power, and a piece of evidence that would shatter his world. It was perfect. John had one more call to make. Detective Miller. He was the one honest cop John had met during his initial inquiries. A veteran officer nearing retirement who had seemed quietly disgusted by his department's corruption. John had cultivated him as a potential ally, feeding him small, anonymous tips. He met Miller in a parking garage. He didn't show him the video. He just told him what was on it. "Town council meeting," John said. 8 o'clock. Be there. With warrants. One for Richard Sterling for conspiracy and obstruction, and one for his son for felony assault. Miller looked at John, his old, tired eyes weighing the man in front of him. He saw the truth there. He saw the chance to do one last right thing before he retired. "You cause a scene at that meeting, the whole world will be watching," Miller said. "That's the point," John replied. Miller nodded slowly. "I'll be there." The town council chamber was packed. The air was thick with smug self-congratulation. Richard Sterling stood at the podium, basking in the glow of the television lights and the fawning praise of the council members. He was talking about community, about progress, about the bright future his new development would bring. He was at the peak of his power, untouchable in his own mind. The main doors of the chamber swung open. John Kane walked in. He was not alone. Behind him were Sarah Jenkins, Marcus Thorne, and a dozen other people. The contractor Sterling had ruined. The family whose son had been the victim of the hit and run. The waitress who had been fired. They were the ghosts of Richard Sterling's past, and they had come for a reckoning. Sterling faltered for a moment, his smooth speech catching in his throat. He saw John's face, and for the second time, he felt that unfamiliar sliver of fear. "What is the meaning of this?" the council president stammered. "This is a private session." "It's about to be very public," Sarah said, holding up her phone, which was now live streaming to her newspaper's website. John walked to the front of the room, stopping directly in front of the podium. He turned to face the crowd, the cameras, the council. "My name is John Kane," he said, his voice calm and clear, carrying to every corner of the room. "And we are here to talk about the real price of Sterling's progress." He nodded to Reaper, who was miles away, but connected. On the large screen behind the council, where Sterling's architectural renderings had been displayed moments before, the image flickered. The alleyway appeared. The video played. There was no sound, but none was needed. The silent, brutal footage filled the room. The shove, the punches, the kicks, the final vicious blow. A collective gasp went through the chamber. Council members looked horrified. Sterling's face went white as a sheet. He stared at the screen, at the image of his son's snarling face, and he knew he was finished. When the video ended, the screen went black. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy, and damning. John turned his gaze back to Richard Sterling. "That," John said, his voice like the tolling of a bell, "is the foundation your empire is built on." Just then, the side doors of the chamber opened. Detective Miller walked in, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. He held up a pair of warrants. "Richard Sterling," Miller said, his voice booming in the silence. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to obstruct justice, witness tampering, and accessory to aggravated assault." He then looked past Sterling to where Richie sat in the front row with his mother, his face a picture of disbelief. A bandage was fresh on his cheek where Lily had scratched him. "Yeah, Richard Sterling, Jr.," Miller continued. "You are under arrest for aggravated assault." The chaos was immediate. Reporters shouted questions. Sterling's wife began to sob. Sterling himself seemed to shrink, his power and arrogance evaporating under the harsh lights. He looked at John, his eyes filled with a dawning, horrified understanding. He hadn't been fighting a disgruntled veteran. He had been fighting a force of nature. As the officers led him away in handcuffs, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him, he finally understood the truth. Some men couldn't be bought. The trial was a formality. With the video evidence, the testimony of a dozen victims, and the digital trail of threats and payoffs that Reaper had uncovered, the prosecution's case was overwhelming. Richard Sterling's high-priced lawyers could do nothing. Richie Sterling was tried as an adult and found guilty. He received a sentence of 10 to 15 years. Richard Sterling Sr. was convicted on all counts: racketeering, conspiracy, obstruction. The judge, citing the systemic nature of his corruption and the terror he had inflicted on the community, gave him the maximum sentence: 25 years to life. One by one, his corrupt allies fell. The police chief was forced to resign and faced his own indictment. The school principal was fired. 2 members of the town council were recalled. The rot was being carved out. The quiet returned. Not the tense, fearful quiet of before, but a true, lasting peace. A few weeks after the sentencing, a woman came to John's house. It was Richard Sterling's wife. She stood on the porch, the same porch where the violence had begun, and she looked small and tired. "I came to apologize," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I knew what my husband was, what my son was becoming, and I did nothing. I was a coward. I am so sorry for what happened to your girl." John just nodded. He didn't offer forgiveness. That wasn't his to give. But he recognized the courage it took for her to come here. Lily recovered. The physical scars faded, but the internal ones remained. Yet she was different now. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet strength. She had faced the monster and had not broken. She volunteered at the local animal shelter, working with abused and frightened dogs. She had a gift for it. John found his own new purpose. He and Ghost started a non-profit. They used their skills to help people who had nowhere else to turn. People targeted by the powerful and ignored by the system. They became guardians for the forgotten. John also began training service dogs for fellow veterans, pairing warriors who needed healing with loyal companions who offered unconditional love. His first trainee was Max, whose ribs had healed, but whose spirit had never been in doubt. One cool autumn evening, John and Lily sat on the back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Max lay at their feet, his head resting on John's boot. They didn't speak for a long time. They didn't need to. The storm had passed. In the quiet that followed, they were healing, together. And so, in the stillness after the long battle, a new kind of life began. It was a life built not on forgetting the past, but on honoring the promises that had been forged within its fire. Courage is not about size or age or rank. It is the choice to stand when all others sit, to speak when all others are silent. God does not always remove the storm from our lives, but He places a strength inside ordinary people to withstand its fury, to become the rock for those who are tossed in the waves. When we choose truth over silence, when we choose justice over convenience, we become the light that drives out the deepest darkness. If this story of courage and unwavering resolve has moved you, please share it with someone who needs to see that one person, armed with the truth, can indeed change the world. Leave a comment with a prayer for the protectors, the guardians who stand watch over the innocent. And subscribe for more stories of hope, faith, and the unyielding power of the human spirit to overcome.